Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for having me here and giving me an opportunity to present my paper. A huge thanks to Oscar Claveria, who was supposed to present first in this session, but kindly let me go first because I'm juggling with two kids at the moment. In Croatia, it's almost bedtime, so I have work to do later on. I will need to disconnect as soon as I finish my presentation. I apologize for that in advance. Okay, so the topic of my paper is ability to consume versus willingness to consume, the role of nonlinearities. As you already mentioned, my name is PETAR SORIC. I work at the University of Zagreb in Croatia. This is just a pretty standard structure of my presentation. I will start with the motivation that led me to do this research. Okay, so basically, when you take a look at the literature, the classic economic models have mainly viewed personal consumption first and foremost as a function of disposable income, and that changed. There was like a paradigm shift when George Katona in the 50s and 60s introduced his concept of willingness to buy versus the ability to buy. With time, and the development of consumer surveys, a wide set of different consumer confidence indicators were introduced, and their predictive characteristics were examined with regards to aggregate consumption. However, not many authors have made a formal attempt of assessing Katona's concept of ability to buy and willingness to buy, and that's basically the niche that we will attack in this paper. So all of us took some kind of microeconomics course, and we were taught about indifference curves, budget constraints, etc. We were taught that the optimal point of consumption is where the ability to buy meets the willingness to buy. However, is that really so? Do these theoretical concepts work well when applied to the real world? That's the main question that I'm asking with this paper, and I will be using survey data from the Joint Harmonized EU Program of Consumer Surveys, and I will use this data as input to approximate Katona's willingness and ability to buy, and to assess their relevance for governing consumption patterns. Okay, so there are three main points that I noticed from the existing literature. First, the existing studies mainly stipulate that the influence of these concepts is constant over time, and that assumption is potentially over-restrictive. That doesn't have to be the case, actually. So I will be using a state space model that will allow for time-varying parameters, time-varying coefficients, to see whether these concepts have a differing role, for example, in different phases of the economic cycle. Next, I also noticed from the literature that there should be considerable asymmetries in the generating process of personal consumption, and I will try to account for that using the nonlinear autoregressive distributed lag model that will take a separate look to the positive and negative changes of both the ability and willingness to buy, and see whether there are really significant asymmetries in that relationships. And second, I noticed that, and third, I noticed that the existing studies mostly cover mainly the US and a couple of highly developed Western EU states. So I will try to widen the geographical scope of the literature and assess 27 EU economies plus the UK, and that will be my sample. Okay, regarding theoretical considerations, there are really like a bunch of theories related to aggregate consumption, starting from Keynes and his absolute income hypothesis. Perhaps the workhorse model, the most widely utilized model is Friedman's permanent income hypothesis. I really don't have time to go into details of each particular theory. I will just try to mention the main points. I will mention Hall's finding from 1978 that the permanent income hypothesis, so he takes a look at the permanent income hypothesis under the assumption of rational expectations. And he finds that if that is really so, then no variable besides current consumption should have predictive power with regard to future consumption. So basically that should be an AR1 process. Later on you will see why that's important in the context of this paper. And also Campbell and Mankiw introduced one of the most popular extensions of PIH, allowing for a share of consumers behaving in line with that theory, and the remaining part simply consuming all of their disposable income. And they basically find that these shares are 50-50. So we have like a split distribution. Throughout this historical overview of consumption theories, you can basically notice that a lot of these authors do acknowledge the relevance of psychological factors, but most of them do not formally quantify them and take them into account in their models. Starting from Keynes, who does recognize the importance of subjective determinants of consumption. Friedman does something very similar, but he doesn't elaborate on these concepts in more detail. Then Katona, as I mentioned previously, and Hall, who built his entire microeconomic model on the so-called intelligent forward-looking agent, forward-looking consumer. Among the more recent studies, I will build upon the paper of Ross from 2008. He basically introduces this type of equation where he treats consumption as a function of its first lag. As I mentioned previously, that's very important in the context of Hall's paper. And he also introduces this omega is the willingness to buy variable, and this is the ability to buy variable. So that's basically the model that I will be building upon here. And that's one of the, as far as I was able to find, that's one of the two papers that formally quantify Katona's concepts of ability and willingness to buy. The second, let me just briefly mention that Ross basically finds evidence in favor of willingness to buy. And the other paper is actually published like half a year ago from Bagestani and Fatima. They use US data, and they use a variety of subjective indicators like consumers' assessments of prices, interest rates, and their general view of the economy. And they found that all of these indicators are highly statistically significant. So what these two papers actually are saying is that the concept of willingness to buy should be an important driver of consumption. So let's start with what I did here. As I said, am using data from 27 EU member states plus the UK. I have two groups of variables. The first one, okay, let me start from the macroeconomic data set, that's number two, because my dependent variable is the year-on-year growth rate of private consumption. I use subjective data. So I extract two proxies for ability to consume and willingness to consume from the European Commission's consumer survey data. And I use a set of control variables the unemployment rate, and the year-on-year inflation rate, which I treat purely as heterogeneous in the context of my model. And I use quarterly data from 1996 to this year, of course, depending on data availability in individual countries. Okay, so this is a pretty important slide. These are the two questions that I am focusing on from the consumer survey. Question number 2 is, how do you expect the financial position of your household to change over the following year? And then respondents are given potential answers, and they have to choose one. And basically, these answers are quantified in the form of response balance. That's basically the difference between the percentages of positive and negative answers. And that's my measure of ability to consume in the context of this study. The second question related to willingness to consume is question number 9. So compared to the past year, do you expect to spend more or less of money on major purchases over the following 12 months? Of course, any of you can notice that this type of indicator, so the response balance to question 9, can be let's say, influenced by consumers' ability to buy also. So I, let's say, purify this in the form, so I basically run a regression. My dependent variable is the response balance of question 9, and I regress it on the response balance of question 2. I extract the residuals, and these residuals are basically a proxy of willingness to consume. It's supposed to be purified of the influence of households' financial situations. So it's supposed to be a pure measure of willingness to consume. When I started to think what's the appropriate methodology for running this study, I noticed Catona's sentence saying that at certain times change in the ability to buy may be of paramount influence, while at other times willingness to buy may improve or deteriorate even when the changes in the environment are in the opposite direction. So basically, there may be some kind of time varying relationship, and that led me to estimate Ross's model via a state space model with time varying parameters. This is basically what it looks like. So CT is current consumption. It's a function of a regressor vector Z, and that includes willingness to buy, ability to buy, consumption itself. I mean, its lagged values, the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate as purely control variables. And in equation 3, you can basically see that I allow for these parameters to be time varying. I model them as a random walk model. So that's like a standard setting in the context of this econometric model. Second, in the literature, I found that several microeconomic studies find considerable asymmetries. So they basically stipulate that consumption should react asymmetrically to positive versus negative changes in willingness to buy and also ability to buy. So I try to take that into account, and I use a nonlinear autoregressive lag distributed model. It looks very complicated. Basically, it's not. So I have, like, this is the positive changes of willingness to buy and negative changes, and also positive and negative changes of the ability to consume. I have all these variables, including the control variables in levels, to test for cointegration and lags of everything further on. I do not impose that there should be asymmetry. I test for that. And if there is significant asymmetry, I include it in the model. The optimal lag structure is chosen through a general to specific procedure, meaning that I basically lose all the insignificant legs because they might make my estimates biased, and I test for co-integration for a long-run relationship between these variables. Okay, as I said, I formally test for asymmetries, and each time the null hypothesis is rejected, I include both positive and negative parameters in the model. In order to present my results in the proper way, I calculate the dynamic multipliers. This is basically something very similar to impulse response functions in the VAR analysis. So it like captures the dynamic response of a particular variable to positive and negative shocks in a particular independent variable, regressor. And then you can basically see if there are significant asymmetries. Okay, so let me present my results. There are several things that need to be discussed here. These are the acronyms for individual countries. This is the first half of countries. The second half is here. I have 28 countries in total. You can see that most of these countries most of these models exhibit time-varying parameters. So TV is an acronym for time-varying. Not many among them are significant. Second, most of these models do not violate any of the model assumption. For example, H stands for heteroscedasticity, N stands for normality. And if you remember Hall's argument that under the permanent income hypothesis, no variable besides the first leg of consumption should be statistically significant in order for the permanent income hypothesis to be valid. So that's basically not the case. I will say something about that further on. And in order to present my results, I give you the dynamic multipliers. As I said, I have 28 economies, 2 variables that are very important. So that would be 2 times 28 figures. I don't have space or time to do that, but I will give you just a few paradigmatic examples, and I will try to verbally summarize my results further on. So this is Estonia, Greece, Croatia, and Ireland. And as you can see, the intensity of the influence of ability to consume on actual consumption, the intensity basically increases literally in the global financial crisis, and that's something that happens very, very often in all of these countries. This is just a brief summary, so I don't have to produce 56 graphs on these figures. So in most of these countries, this is basically what happens. In some countries, like in France, Croatia, Italy, Latvia, etc., what happens is that there are more local maxima of the relationship at hand, of the parameters that I'm estimating, but one of them is always the global financial crisis. Most often, the other one is the consequent European sovereign debt crisis. So the intensity of these parameters probably has something to do with the state of the economy. And there are just like a few exceptions to this regularity, such as Cyprus, Slovakia, Romania, and Finland. Regarding the willingness to consume, the influence is not that robust. It does exhibit time variability. It also can be related to the global financial crisis, like you see on the graphs, but it's not so common as it is for the ability to buy. Okay, there are a lot of more countries that do not exhibit such scenarios here. And I think I'm running out of time, so I will just try to briefly wrap it up. Regarding the results of the nonlinear autoregressive model, Okay, so let me just explain this. This column represents the long-run parameters of positive changes in the ability to buy. These are the long-run parameters of the negative changes in the ability to buy. And this is the same case for willingness to buy, positive and negative. As you can see from the co-integration column, in most cases, there is a significant long-run relationship between these variables. Almost all countries exhibit asymmetries either in the short run, denoted by this SR, or sometimes both in the short and long run, so SR and LR. Regarding the let's say the shape and the magnitude and the intensity of the found parameters, I will again discuss this in terms of dynamic multipliers. The function denoted with little plus signs or little crosses, that's the dynamic response of consumption to positive changes in ability to buy, and the minus signs are the responses to negative changes in the ability to buy. CZ is Czech Republic. I also give you just a few countries so you understand the main results. I don't have time or space to go through each individual country. And this is the corresponding results for Deutschland, meaning Germany. As you can see, the blue line is the asymmetry. It's the difference between the positive and negative dynamic multipliers, and this asymmetry is statistically different from zero. You can see the 95% confidence interval around it. So it is statistically significant. There really are asymmetries for many of the countries in the sample. Trying to summarize this, these asymmetries are present only in the short run, 10 months or less, as you can see here. So after 10 months, it basically fades away to zero. So in the long run, in most of the cases, there is a long run relationship, but it is not asymmetric. It is purely symmetric. The signs are pretty much what you would expect. So positive changes stimulate consumption, negative changes discourages further expenditure. And this is precisely what happens for the majority of countries. For 13 out of 19 countries with significant asymmetries. Also, the asymmetry is such that it is in line with the postulates of prospect theory, meaning that the reactions to negative changes of the willingness and ability to buy are more intensive than those to positive ones. And this type of finding is much more pronounced for the ability to buy than it is for the willingness to buy variable. Okay, and let me just briefly conclude because I don't have much time. So I build upon the conceptual foundations laid by Katona. I extract both the ability and willingness to buy from consumer surveys, and I find that the effects of these two variables are heavily dependent on the business cycle. Both of them are most intensive during economic crisis, which can be related to a lot of previous literature. And our nonlinear estimates point to considerable asymmetries in the effect of ability to consume. In most of the cases, that is not that point is not valid for the willingness to consume. Overall, I find that the ability to consume basically dominates over the willingness to consume effect. And I explain that by the fact that my estimation period is heavily governed by several harsh recession periods, such as the global financial crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis, and the COVID pandemic that we are currently facing. So they are basically dominating my sample and causing these results. Okay, thank you for your attention. I hope I was on time and I didn't cross the line here.